a minute. Didn't we just hear our dear St. Paul elucidate all of his accomplishments? Listening to them one after another. I competed well. I finished the race. I kept the faith. And yet the Pharisee who Jesus condemns did exactly the same thing. I tithe. I fast. He's enumerating his accomplishments. So what's the difference? Well, St. Luke gives us the hint of this in the very introduction to our gospel today. Jesus is addressing those who applaud themselves but despise everyone else. Jesus isn't knocking down anyone who's telling the truth about what they've accomplished, but he does take umbrage with those who are dripping with superiority, like this Pharisee. Now, my friends, I don't know if you've noticed it, but I've noticed over the last several years that a lot of our humor that's supposed to lighten our spirits and lift us up, and a lot of our national discourse, which is supposed to inspire us, is given to us at the expense of other people, at the expense of others. Jesus asks us to examine this morning. And so let's make this real. If this were a town hall meeting or a dispute between the tax collector and the Pharisee, Jesus would be that man at the very end who has the last question. Why don't you give me some of the good points of that other person? Tell me the good points. That's what Jesus is asking us to consider. And what a tragedy that all of the great accomplishments of the Pharisee are for nothing. Not because they were bad, but because of his attitude of superiority over the other. His prayers, which reflect his attitude, do not get him to God. They instead lead him into a dark place within himself. And why don't they get him to God? Simply because there's no place, nothing for God to do. God doesn't have any involvement with this man's life because he has done everything all by himself. He doesn't need God's help. And people, can you imagine? People are nothing more than the definition of people is nothing more than their sins. They're nothing more than their sins and not worthy of redemption, not worthy of being saved, not worthy of God, and not worthy even of my attention. But this is where it gets dangerous for that Pharisee, and we have to examine ourselves, because this turns from that dark place, that shell that the Pharisee is within, it turns to sometimes violence. It turns sometimes to hatred and complete disdain for not only individuals, but for other groups as well. From within that safe shell where I am the only one who is there. That's the Pharisee. How about the tax collector? Jesus loves this guy. The tax collector is a complete disaster, socially, spiritually, and patriotically. But still, he's in the temple, and Jesus loves him simply because he's there in complete humility. He's after God, and he knows that God resides somewhere within him, and so he's beating on the door of his heart, asking God to come out and help him. Help him through, initially, mercy and forgiveness. But he acknowledges that he's a sinner. He has the humility that Jesus is after, and he can be worked with. He can go further. My friends, the tax collector's prayer is the kind of prayer that leads us toward God. The other kind of prayer, the other kind of attitude, doesn't lead us quite there. It leads us to another place. We all want to achieve God and find him and acknowledge him as our Father. And perhaps the only way we can do that is to acknowledge that all of God's children are our brothers and sisters, the children of God as well. And so I challenge each one of us, myself included, perhaps through this next week, maybe for the rest of our lives, to when we hear a joke or something that's supposed to be humorous at the expense of someone else, just very simply turn your head and walk away. With God's help, we can do this, and we all can. We can do better by turning away from both humor and discourse that is at the expense of others. We owe it to ourselves to be better.